May 9th, 1945. Northern Germany. The war is over, yet in the cellar of a shattered farmhouse, the world still holds its breath. 17 women, once clerks, typists, radio operators, and nurses for the Wehrmacht, crouched together in the half-dark. Their hands are raw, uniforms grimy with soot and blood. Above them, the ceiling trembles under heavy boots. Not German boots. The rhythm is different. Slower, heavier, certain. British. The war that promised them eternity has ended in dust. But inside this damp cellar, time feels frozen. The air reeks of smoke and fear. One girl whispers a prayer, another clutches a photograph to her chest. A brother, a fiancé, a field gray uniform smiling into a vanished world. A cough echoes. Someone stifles it. Then, the sound. A blunt, measured pounding at the wooden trapdoor above. Aufmachen. The word doesn't come in German. It's English, but sharp, commanding, unmistakable. The women look at each other. For weeks they'd been told what capture meant. Allied soldiers would humiliate them, strip them, make them crawl. Some were told the British were worse than the Russians, colder, more cunning. Others heard stories of retribution, of nurses dragged through the mud, of auxiliaries beaten for what they had served. Now the moment had arrived. One of them, a lieutenant's aide named Greta Hoffmann, stood slowly, clutching the splintered wall for balance. Her body shook not from cold, but from the shock of finality. The collapse of every order she'd obeyed since her teenage years. Above, light spilled through the cracks, golden and alien. Dust fell in narrow beams, like drifting ash. The trapdoor creaked open. A silhouette filled the frame. Broad shoulders, helmet, rifle. Behind him, 2 others. Sunlight poured around their shapes, so bright it seemed almost cruel. Greta blinked. The soldier's voice came calm, low, practiced. "Come up." One at a time, hands visible. Silence. No one moved. Another voice, softer. "You'll be safe. No one will hurt you." That broke something. The youngest, barely 18, began to sob, her cries echoing off the brick walls. Greta lifted her hand in trembling reassurance, then climbed the wooden steps. Her boots found each rung like they were stepping out of a grave. When her head rose above the threshold, she saw the landscape for the first time in weeks. Gray morning sky, the ruins of barns, a white flag hanging limply from a broken pole, and the men, British soldiers, standing in their khaki, not shouting, not smiling, just watching. Their faces unreadable, their posture alert but not cruel. One gestured toward a field cart, where blankets and medical kits were piled beside tins of tea and biscuits. Greta hesitated, expecting mockery. None came. "Name?" the sergeant asked. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Her German sounded foreign to her own ears when she finally managed. "Greta Hoffmann, Nachrichtenhelferin." He wrote it carefully on a clipboard, then nodded. "You'll be taken to a holding camp. Women's section. Food and wash first." Wash, the word made her flinch. It carried memories of propaganda, of what washing might mean under enemy hands. She looked toward her companions, still climbing out of the cellar one by one, each woman's face drawn tight with the same unspoken dread. The soldiers stepped back, allowing space. No jeers, no stares. Just quiet procedure. Efficient and impersonal. As they were escorted down the lane, the air smelled of rain and ash. The war had stripped color from everything. The fields were trampled mud, the houses hollowed shells. Yet, in that desolation, the British lorries looked oddly clean. like relics from a world that had never known ruin. Inside one, the women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. Greta stared at her knees. The sound of the engine was soft compared to the artillery she'd lived through. Still, every bump made her flinch. Her mind replayed the stories of captivity, of shame, of what victors might do. She tried to prepare herself for degradation, rehearsing numbness as a shield. Hours passed. The truck rolled through villages where children watched silently from doorways. A church bell rang somewhere. Not for victory, but for burial. When the convoy stopped at last, the women were ordered out. They found themselves before a barbed wire enclosure, neat and orderly, with whitewashed huts and a wooden sign. British Army Prisoner Processing Station, Sector 8. A corporal motioned them forward. Personal effects here, then showers, then medical. The word showers fell like a thunderclap. Some froze. Some whispered in terror. One clutched her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Greta's heart slammed against her ribs. She remembered the rumors of camps, of gas, of cleansing that meant death. Her legs refused to move, a British nurse noticed. She stepped closer, her accent soft but firm. "It's all right, love. Just water. You'll feel better after." Her tone carried no mockery, only fatigue, as if she'd said it 100 times before. She pointed toward a low wooden hut with steam rising from vents in the roof. The smell of soap drifted faintly through the air. Real soap, not smoke, not decay. Greta took a step forward. The ground felt unreal, too solid to trust. Inside the hut, metal pipes dripped over tiled floors. Warm mist hung like fog. She reached for the wall to steady herself. Other women entered hesitantly, their faces ghost pale, waiting for cruelty that never came. Then, the sound, a hiss, a sudden rush of water, clear, clean, endless. Greta's knees weakened. A sob escaped her before she could stop it. Water, hot, alive, cascading down her hands, her arms, her face. It wasn't death. It was rebirth. Outside, through the open door, a British orderly turned his eyes politely away. He lit a cigarette, exhaled into the gray afternoon, and stood watch in silence. For the first time since surrender, the women did not smell of fear. Greta's hair was still damp when she stepped out of the wash house. The robe they gave her was stiff, scratchy, but dry and clean. She clutched it tighter around her body as the breeze bit across the compound. Steam still curled from the collar of her skin, and her knees trembled not from cold, but from something deeper. The sense that the world had not ended, but somehow changed without warning. Around her, the others emerged in silence, towel-wrapped and wide-eyed. None of them had spoken yet. They moved like ghosts from one corridor of disbelief to another. Each woman carried in her silence 1,000 memories. The indoctrination lectures, the discipline drills, the pamphlets filled with warnings about what would happen if you fall into enemy hands. None of those prepared them for warm water, folded towels, or tea. A British nurse, older than Greta's mother, stood at the edge of the wooden barracks and gestured them toward a row of wooden doors. "Toilets. You'll be given uniforms next. Toilets." The word didn't fully translate in her head. In field units, Greta had crouched behind trucks or used slit trenches like every other Helferin. In barracks, it was the bucket and pan system, crude, cold, quick. But these doors looked different. Greta approached one with cautious steps. She opened it. Inside, the small cubicle was clean. A white porcelain bowl, a metal lever, a narrow window above the door, and tiled floors. She blinked, not from confusion, but because it looked like something out of a hotel, not a military camp. She stepped in, turned to latch the door, and sat. The porcelain was shockingly cold. Then she noticed the chain. A thin, chrome lever glinted beside the wall. Her hand hesitated. What did it do? Curiosity overruled fear. She reached out and pulled the lever. A roar, sudden and violent, filled the space. Water gushed into the bowl with a swirling noise so loud it made her flinch. She nearly stood up in panic. For one terrifying moment, she thought she'd broken something. But then the sound stopped, and the bowl was clean again. She stared at it, breathing fast, her heart pounding like it had in air raids. A flush toilet, an absurd thing, almost mythic. The kind of luxury whispered about during boring nights on guard duty. Something British officers had, maybe American generals. Not something she had ever touched, not in training, not in the field, not in the ruins of Hamburg, not even at home. Greta reached forward, flushed it again. The roar came back, thunderous, alive. She laughed. It burst out of her like a gasp, sharp and sudden. Not out of humor, but disbelief. Something between joy and madness. She laughed until tears filled her eyes, and she pressed her palm over her mouth to silence it. Her whole body shook. It wasn't the toilet itself that moved her. It was the fact that it worked, that someone had thought to make it, that this country, this enemy, had the time, the structure, the care to build something just for human comfort. In Germany, the water mains were shattered. Pipes leaked, latrines overflowed. In the last months of war, her unit had used charcoal tins to relieve themselves behind sandbags. And here, a door opened, and civilization came rushing out of the wall. When she emerged, a few other women had already taken turns. One stood beside the fence, dazed, wiping her eyes. Another had flushed 3 times and was now explaining in hushed, reverent tones how the system worked to a wide-eyed comrade. Greta didn't say anything. She just stood in the sun, robe clutched tight, breathing. She noticed one of the British guards watching her. Their eyes met. He didn't leer. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He simply stood there, rifle resting against his shoulder, and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The kind a man gives a stranger on a quiet street. She nodded back. It was the first human connection she'd had in weeks. A corporal came by and handed her a folded uniform. British military surplus. Not beautiful. Thick wool, itchy seams, faded brown-gray. But it was clean, warm, dry. She changed inside a curtained tent and stared at herself in a mirror fragment taped to a wooden beam. No insignia, no eagle, no swastika. Just a woman. Pale, hollow-cheeked, hair cut bluntly to regulation. A civilian soul in borrowed clothes. The reflection didn't lie. She looked young, younger than the ideology that raised her, younger than the machine that dressed her in uniform. She stepped out. The others stood in uneven lines near the mess hut. Some of them looked unsure whether to stand at attention. No one barked orders. There were no ranks now. No file, no formation. Just women, side by side, waiting to be fed. And then, as if the absurdity couldn't go further, they were handed porcelain plates, real plates. A British cook, sleeves rolled to the elbows, face streaked with sweat. Scooped potatoes and gravy onto each dish. Meat, carrots, bread. A woman whispered behind Greta, "They're feeding us like humans." Another said, "They think we're worth plates." And still another, "We were told they'd make us beg." Greta sat on a wooden bench and looked down at her food. Her stomach twisted, not with hunger, but confusion. Gratitude felt like treason. How do you eat when the enemy gives you kindness? How do you eat when everything you believed would happen doesn't? She picked up the fork and took a bite. It tasted like the end of something. Greta chewed slowly, not for politeness, but because her mouth had forgotten the rhythm of food that wasn't powdered, scorched, or bitter with tin. The gravy was lukewarm and too salty, and yet it was the most real thing she'd tasted in months. Her tongue pushed against the smooth surface of the potatoes like it was searching for memory. Across the table, Hilda Becker, the one who used to hum lullabies when the bombs fell, sat hunched, staring at her untouched bread. Her lips parted slightly as if she meant to say something, but no sound came. On her plate, the butter began to melt. Greta swallowed. Her throat ached, not from pain, but the weight of swallowing in a place where no one had screamed. Around them, the British guards moved quietly, their boots crunching on gravel. They weren't relaxed, not yet. But neither were they cruel. They spoke in soft tones to one another. No one barked, no one struck. There were no dogs, no shouted commands, no camp capos with rubber truncheons. Just order and stillness, and the wind rolling through the open compound like it had nothing left to fear. Someone at the end of the bench began to cry, not loud, not with drama. Just slow, shaking sobs. The kind that come after everything has already broken. No one told her to stop. No one shushed her. They just let her cry. Greta stared at her fork. She remembered a lecture. Winter of 1943, just before she was posted to the Signals Corps. The instructor, a thin man with medals on a tunic too large for him, had barked about Anglo-Saxon weakness. "The Englishman smiles at the woman he will enslave," he had said. "Do not mistake politeness for mercy. They do not forgive. They do not forget." She remembered writing that sentence down in her notebook. She remembered believing it. But here, there was no hate. There was no vengeance. There was only food, warmth, soap, a toilet that flushed. These weren't signs of decay. They were signs of something Greta didn't yet have words for. Something dangerously close to decency. A guard walked past, young, freckles on his cheek, rifle over his shoulder, boots scuffed and dusty. As he passed the crying girl, he slowed slightly, then placed something on the edge of the table. A square of cloth, clean, folded, a handkerchief. Then he kept walking, not a word spoken. The girl reached for it as if it might disappear. That was when the silence inside Greta began to splinter. She stood up and walked away from the table, past the lines of women waiting for their own plates, past the barrels of waste and the bucket of soap water. She needed to breathe, needed to understand. She found a quiet corner behind the medical hut, where a patch of wild grass still grew beside the fence. It hadn't been trampled yet. A few dandelions bloomed defiantly near a stone foundation. She knelt, touched one with a trembling hand. A childhood memory surfaced. Spring before the war. Chasing her brother through a meadow outside Leipzig, the smell of grass and horse manure and warm bread in her mother's kitchen. That was before uniforms, before swastikas, before all the lines were drawn and redrawn in her mind. A cough broke her thoughts. She turned. A British soldier, not a boy, not yet an old man, stood a few paces away. He held a tin cup and looked like he hadn't slept in days. His jacket was unbuttoned at the top, and his cap sat crooked on his sweat-damp hair. "Sorry," he said in thick English. "Didn't mean to frighten you." She said nothing. He nodded at the fence. "You all right?" Greta hesitated, then nodded once. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. He didn't press, just leaned against the hut and took a sip from his tin. "Hard days," he said after a while. "We thought it'd feel different. When it ended," she looked at him then, really looked, and saw the exhaustion behind his eyes. Not triumph, not hatred, just the dull ache of a man who'd seen too much and carried more than he could ever explain. "They said you'd hate us," she said, surprised by her own voice. He blinked. "We do?" He let that sit in the air, then added, "But not like that." Greta didn't understand the difference. Not yet. But the way he said it, flat, heavy, without anger, felt like a truth too large for her to hold. He finished his drink, tapped the cup twice against the wall, and turned to go. Then paused. "You should eat," he said. "You look like you forgot how." And then he was gone. Greta stayed there, crouched in the grass, until the sun dipped behind the fence line. When she returned to the barracks, someone had folded her blanket. The sight of it, the wool corners aligned neatly, the surface smoothed flat, stopped Greta in the doorway. Such a small thing. And yet her body reacted as if she'd stumbled into a sacred space. In the Wehrmacht quarters, no one ever folded a blanket for you. Discipline was your duty, kindness your weakness. But here, in this British camp built from planks and corrugated tin, someone had taken a moment to make her bed look human. She touched the fabric. It still held warmth, not hers, but someone else's hand. For a second, she couldn't move. Her chest tightened. It wasn't sentimentality. It was shock. The quiet, disorienting kind that comes when the world contradicts everything you've been told to fear. Outside, the evening horn sounded, a hollow, almost mournful note rolling through the camp. The other women stirred, gathering near the door as the guards called for roll. Greta followed them into the fading light. The compound glowed faintly under the setting sun, the sky brushed with ash and amber. Rows of wire fences stretched toward the horizon, beyond which wheat fields rippled in the wind, green, alive, untouched by fire. The British sergeant read from his clipboard. Voices answered, one by one, subdued, obedient. When he reached the last name, he lowered the paper and nodded. All accounted for. That'll do. He turned to go, but paused and looked back at them. Mess hall again at dawn. Tea's at 6. Tea, the word sounded absurdly gentle in this place of surrender. As the guards dispersed, the women drifted back to their huts. Conversation came in fragments now. Not the loud, nervous chatter of the first morning, but something softer. Hilda whispered that she'd seen real sugar in the tea earlier. Another woman swore she smelled lavender soap in the washroom. Small miracles traded like contraband. Greta sat on her bunk and watched the light fade through the slats. Her thoughts moved like ghosts, slow, uncertain. She had served in signals, decoding messages, relaying coordinates for air defense. She had believed in precision, in structure, in duty. Those things had filled her days, kept her upright while the cities burned. Now, stripped of it all, she realized how little of herself remained. The barracks dimmed. Someone hummed, a low tune, almost a lullaby. It was Hilda again. The melody floated through the room like smoke from a dying candle. Greta lay back and listened. For the first time in months, her eyelids felt heavy without fear pressing them shut. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a sound. Faint footsteps outside. She froze. The old instinct, hide, don't move, don't breathe, clenched her muscles tight. Shadows flickered against the wall. Then a thin shaft of light slipped through the cracks between the planks. A guard on patrol. He moved slowly, swinging a lantern, its glow brushing the edges of their faces. For a moment, Greta's gaze met his through the slit of the wood. His expression wasn't suspicious, only weary. The lantern light haloed in the mist of his breath as he turned away. It was strange, she thought, that light could feel safe again. Morning came gray and wet. Rain pattered softly on the tin roof, a gentle rhythm that reminded her of summers long ago. The air inside the barracks smelled faintly of soap and damp wool. Someone laughed, a small, awkward sound, as they tried to fold their blanket like the British did. Greta found herself smiling. After roll call, they were told to clean the floorboards and polish the stoves. A corporal explained through halting German and gestures that it wasn't punishment, hygiene, he said, for everyone. He even smiled when they finished. By noon, the rain had stopped. The women were ordered to line up near the infirmary. Medical inspection. That word, inspection, sent a shiver through them. Old fears stirred again. They expected humiliation, exposure, perhaps revenge disguised as procedure. Instead, a British nurse led them inside, one by one. The hut smelled of carbolic and warm metal. White sheets hung between the examination tables for privacy. The nurse, red-haired, mid-40s, sleeves rolled, spoke gently through an interpreter. "You've been through a lot. We'll check for lice, infection, fever, nothing else." When it was Greta's turn, she braced herself, jaw locked. But the nurse was quick, efficient, and kind. She examined Greta's eyes, throat, hands, asked about burns and coughs, then pressed a cup of liquid into her palm. "Tonic," she said. "For the nerves." Greta drank. It tasted bitter. But afterward, a warmth spread through her chest, and she realized she was trembling, not from fear now, but from relief. Before she left, the nurse paused. "You're not prisoners anymore, not like before," she said quietly, choosing her words carefully. "You're people. You'll be treated that way here." Greta nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the clouds had broken. A pale beam of sunlight touched the wet gravel, turning puddles into mirrors. For a fleeting second, she saw her reflection in one. Thin, pale, eyes hollow, but alive. The sight startled her. She had stopped expecting to see herself as real. She returned to the barracks and sat on the bunk. The folded blanket waited. Still precise, still perfect. She unfolded it slowly, ran her fingers across the seams, and lay back beneath it. Through the cracks in the roof, light spilled in thin, trembling lines. Dust motes drifted like snowflakes. She closed her eyes and let the sound of distant British voices fade into the hum of the afternoon. It occurred to her then, as the warmth spread through her chest, that survival had always felt like guilt. Until this moment, when it began to feel like permission. The next morning came not with thunder, but birdsong. Greta stirred under the blanket before the horn blew. Outside, the sky was pale and empty, the kind of post-war gray that held no promises. Her limbs ached in places she didn't have names for, but the tightness in her jaw had loosened slightly, as if her teeth no longer had to stay clenched through the night. She sat up, feet pressing against the cold wooden floor of the barrack. Someone had placed a folded cloth bundle at the edge of her bed. A second pair of socks, a bar of soap, a chipped enamel cup. There was no note, no instructions. Just another gesture that made no sense under the rules she'd memorized. No one saluted anymore. No one shouted Jawohl. No one barked ranks or slogans. For the first time since Hitler's voice had filled schoolrooms and radio sets, there was silence in the place where obedience used to live. Roll call that morning was quicker. Fewer names to read now. Some women had already been transferred to civilian relocation units. The British Guards began calling them by given names, not numbers or military titles. "Miss Greta," one said, reading from a clipboard. She didn't correct him. She didn't tell him she had once been a Gefreiter. That title no longer fit. It was like a snake's skin, shed behind her on the muddy road to surrender. After tea, still weak but warm and sweetened, they were given brushes and buckets. Greta was assigned to sweep the camp's small administrative hut. She expected grime, neglect, perhaps rats. But inside, Everything was in order. Folders labeled in English, chairs neatly pushed in, a bulletin board lined with notices typed in block letters, vaccination schedules, food delivery charts, POW rights under the Geneva Convention. The last one stopped her. She read it 3 times. All prisoners shall be treated humanely. It was printed clearly, without sarcasm, as if no one questioned it. She remembered what had happened to captured British flyers in Berlin, what she'd been told by officers in her unit, that mercy was weakness, that retaliation was just. Yet here, pinned to a board with a dull brass tack, was a sentence that stood like a stone in the rushing current. A corporal came in, young, reading a logbook. He barely noticed her at first, then gave a small nod. "Morning, miss." She murmured a reply, almost forgetting herself. He passed by, dropped a biscuit on her work table, and left. That was it. No sneer, no warning, just a biscuit. She stared at it for several minutes before picking it up. The taste was dry, crumbly, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the absence of cruelty, the deliberate, confusing absence. That afternoon, they were taken outside the fence for the first time. 2 guards escorted a group of 12 women, including Greta, through the gate and down a gravel path that led to an orchard, now blooming wildly in the post-war quiet. Their task was to clear fallen branches and gather kindling. It was menial work, but something about being outside the wire, in open air, felt unreal. As if the world itself had lifted the roof of a cellar and invited them to breathe. Greta found herself working beside Annalisa, a nurse who had served near Hamburg. Annalisa had a deep cut on her left hand, infected weeks ago, poorly dressed. The British sergeant had noticed earlier and told her to stay out of the mud. Now, as they gathered sticks beneath a crabapple tree, Annalisa looked at the sky and said quietly, "It feels like we died. And someone sent us back to the wrong world." Greta didn't answer, but she understood. They had expected punishment, shame, chains. Perhaps they'd even prepared for it, deep down. A way to make sense of what they'd done, or hadn't done. A way to pay. But this? Hot water, flushing toilets, blankets folded with care, and now sunlight filtering through orchard leaves. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't revenge either. And that made it harder. One of the guards pointed out a pile of wet branches and said something about rot. He didn't order, he just pointed. Then he lit a cigarette and waited as they carried the bundles toward the trailer. When Greta passed him, he spoke again, not to command, but to ask, "Did you hear about Dresden?" She stiffened, yes. His face remained neutral. "My brother was in Coventry." Then he exhaled smoke and said nothing more. Greta kept walking. That evening, during mess, the women were quieter. The noise of metal cutlery was softer now. Some of them sat in loose groups, no longer huddled as if expecting to be struck. They were beginning to speak again, not about the Reich or Hitler or the future, but small things. The smell of soap, the color of the sky, the memory of a meal from before the war. After curfew, Greta stood at the edge of the barrack doorway and looked up. The stars were out. There was no blackout curtain, no sirens, no flak bursts tearing the sky, just wind and stars and silence. And in that moment, stripped of uniform, of command, of fear, she realized something she hadn't dared to consider. No one was watching. No one was listening. She could become someone else. Greta awoke before the horn. The air was damp and cool, the kind that clung to skin and crept beneath blankets. But she didn't pull the wool tighter. She lay still, watching as faint morning light filtered through the cracks in the wood. The world outside had stopped screaming. That was enough. She listened. A bird chirped from somewhere near the fence. Then another. It wasn't the first time she'd heard birdsong since arriving, but it was the first time she didn't brace for the reply of gunfire or distant bombing. The silence between the notes felt whole. From the bunk beside her, Hilda stirred and turned over, still asleep. On the far wall, someone had begun pinning drawings. Small ones, rough pencil sketches of trees, of faces, of hands holding spoons. No swastikas, no eagles. Just human things. Greta sat up, swung her legs to the floor, and pressed her palms to her knees. Her fingernails had grown soft, not brittle from hunger anymore, but pliable. She flexed them. They looked like they belonged to someone else. The British nurse returned that morning with clipboards and a new interpreter. A quiet man in civilian trousers and a wool cap. He read out a list of names. Each woman was asked to confirm her identity and place of origin. When he got to Greta, he paused. Hoffman, Greta, Leipzig? Greta nodded. Yes. The nurse smiled faintly, ticking a box. You're on the list for reintegration processing. Greta blinked. What does that mean? You'll be moved soon. To a civilian camp. It means you're being released from military status. Released. The word struck her like a slap. For years, her identity had been sewn into her sleeve, her station, her rank, her blood. Orders and borders had defined her world. Now, a stranger with a clipboard was telling her that she was... What? A civilian again? A blank page? The interpreter looked at her. Do you still want to be called Helferin Hoffman? Greta hesitated. She opened her mouth to say yes, then stopped. No, she whispered. Just Greta. He nodded without comment, as if the answer were the most natural thing in the world. Later that day, as the women lined up for medical clearance, Greta watched as one of the guards brought out a package. Cloth-bound, carefully labeled in German. Eigentum. Greta Hoffman. Property. It was her satchel, the one she'd left in the farmhouse cellar the day they were captured. She opened it slowly, fingers trembling. Inside were the things she'd assumed were lost or burned. Her diary, water-damaged but intact. A small tin of hairpins. A photo of her parents on a park bench. And her Wehrmacht auxiliary badge. Dented, scratched, the eagle and swastika worn smooth from handling. She stared at it. It had once been sacred. A badge of pride, of purpose. Now it looked like something unearthed from the bottom of a river. She turned it over, then slid it back into the satchel without a word. That evening, they gathered in the mess for what the guards called a briefing. A British officer stood at the front, not stern, not warm, just tired and factual. He spoke through the interpreter, explaining that many of them would be moved to camps farther inland. Some would be given identification papers, temporary housing. They would be processed as women, as civilians, as Germans. He said nothing about guilt, nothing about punishment. Only this: you're not prisoners anymore. But the world will remember what the uniform meant. What you do next, how you carry yourselves, will speak louder than your service records. Greta sat motionless as the words settled over them like dust. That night, a storm broke. Rain hammered the tin roof in heavy sheets. Thunder cracked across the sky, and wind moaned through the camp fences like a voice trying to be remembered. Some of the women cried in their bunks. Others curled tighter under blankets, trembling not from cold, but from the sound of a world reasserting itself. Greta stood at the doorway, barefoot on the wood, and watched the sky split open. She let the wind whip through her damp hair. For the first time, she didn't flinch. In the distance, the orchard trees bent and swayed, their branches like arms, surrendering to something bigger than themselves. Behind her, the barrack door creaked gently in the wind. "Greta," someone called softly. Not Helferin, not Fräulein, just Greta. She turned. Hilda stood holding a blanket in one hand, eyes wide. "You'll catch cold," she said. Greta stepped back inside, wiping the rain from her cheeks with her sleeve. But she wasn't shivering. Not anymore. The rain lingered into morning, soft and steady, like a blanket laid over the camp. Greta sat alone on the edge of the latrine steps, chin resting on her knees, watching the water ripple in the gravel. The sky above remained dull, no sun, no shadows, just a gray that soaked the world and asked for silence. It was in this quiet that she reached into her satchel again. Her fingers brushed the metal, cold and familiar. She pulled it out slowly, the badge. Wehrmacht Helferin. Eagle wings spread wide, the claws still clutching the swastika, though the edges had worn smooth, the lines dulled with age and grime. She turned it over in her palm. It had once meant everything: belonging, order, pride. It had been her entrance into a machine she'd been taught to revere. She remembered the oath. Ich gelobe. The promise to serve, to obey. She was 17 when she spoke those words. Too young to see what they bound her to. Now it felt like something dead. She stared across the yard to the metal barrel where the guards sometimes burned waste. Smoke curled lazily from its rim, dampened by rain, but the embers still glowed faintly. She stood up, walked slowly toward it. The gravel crunched under her boots. Soft, measured steps. No one called after her. No one asked what she was doing. She paused before the barrel, heart pounding, the weight of her entire past in her fist. Her fingers trembled. Then she dropped the badge into the fire. It landed with a dull clink on the coals. For a moment, it just sat there, out of place, defiant. Then, the blackened heat licked at it, smoke rising around the edges. The insignia began to warp. She didn't watch it melt. She turned away. There was no applause, no redemption. Just the soft hiss of metal surrendering to flame. Back in the barracks, no one noticed her hands were empty. Hilda was combing out her hair with a British-issued ivory comb, humming quietly. Annalisa was washing socks in a metal basin. No one saluted. No one asked who they had once been. The war had taught them to erase. But now, absence felt like something earned. That afternoon, the guards allowed them to walk to the outer fence under escort. Beyond the wire, the countryside rolled in gentle green hills, dotted with sheep and hedgerows. It looked like another planet, untouched by tanks, unscarred by bombs. Life had gone on here, and in some strange way, it had won. Greta stood beside Hilda, arms folded across her chest. She didn't speak. Neither did Hildy. Then, out of nowhere, Hilda said, "I used to think the English were soft. That kindness was weakness." Greta didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "So did I." A pause. Hilda turned to her. "It wasn't." "No," Greta said. "It wasn't." That night, a group of women huddled near the mess hall after curfew, whispering by the laundry line. They had found an old copy of Mein Kampf hidden inside a crate, likely left behind by some officer months earlier. They debated what to do with it. Some wanted to keep it, a souvenir, proof of where they'd come from. Others said it should be buried, forgotten. Greta said nothing, just listened. Eventually, someone tore the book in half. Then again and again. The pages scattered in the mud like torn feathers. No fire, no ceremony. Just paper surrendering to rain. In the days that followed, things moved quickly. British officials arrived with typewriters and cameras. Identification photos were taken. Papers were signed. The women were no longer referred to as POWs, but as repatriation candidates. The vocabulary changed first, then, slowly, so did the posture, the voice, the gaze. They were each assigned new destinations: Leipzig, Dresden, Bremen. Most of them would go home to ruins. But for Greta, home no longer meant a street or a town. It meant something quieter now. The night before departure, Greta returned to the washroom. She stood in front of the sink, water running warm from the tap. She cupped it in her hands and pressed it to her face. No one had to tell her to wash. She did it slowly, deliberately. Not as a ritual, not as routine, but as a kind of absolution. As she dried her face with the coarse towel, she noticed a small notice tacked near the mirror. "Leave this place as you would wish to find it." She read it 3 times. That evening, she folded her blanket, not out of obedience, but because it felt right. She placed her satchel by the door, sat on the edge of her bunk, and stared out the window one last time. Tomorrow she would leave, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, just as Greta. The sun rose behind a veil of mist that morning, casting a thin silver light over the British camp. A truck rumbled outside the wire, its engine coughing like an old man waking from sleep. The women stood in a quiet line near the barracks, their satchels at their feet, eyes fixed on the ground. No orders, no barking voices, no anthem. There was no ceremony for their departure. Only names called from a clipboard, one by one. Greta listened as others stepped forward. Hilda, Annalisa, the girl with the burned scar on her wrist. Some would head east, some west. They were going home. Though what that word meant now was fragile, uncertain. When the corporal read Greta Hoffman, she answered with a nod, then hoisted her satchel over her shoulder. It was lighter than she remembered. Not because it held less, but because she no longer carried it like a uniform. She climbed into the truck's rear bed, taking her place on the bench beside Annalisa. The wood was damp with morning dew. Across from her, another former auxiliary stared blankly ahead, lips moving silently in prayer or memory. No one spoke. The gate creaked open. The truck lurched forward. Greta looked back just once, at the camp, the wire, the slanted roofs of the huts. Behind those walls had been something she never expected. Decency. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but a refusal to hate. It was not what she was taught to expect from the enemy. And perhaps that made it all the more powerful. As the truck wound down a narrow lane, trees arched overhead, their leaves slick with rain. The world smelled of wet soil and spring grass. A rabbit darted across the path ahead, vanishing into the brush. Life, unapologetic and unbothered by uniforms or borders. Annalisa leaned closer. "Do you think we'll ever be normal again?" Greta didn't answer right away. "I don't know if we were ever normal to begin with," she said finally. The truck passed a farmhouse where a British child stood barefoot in the doorway, watching them. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared with that particular kind of young wisdom that comes from growing up too close to war. For a moment, Greta wanted to hide her face, but she didn't. Let him see. Let the world see. They reached the processing center just before noon, a low brick building repurposed from an old train depot. Inside, German-speaking clerks asked quiet questions. Name, birthplace, former occupation, desired destination. Greta answered them all without hesitation. "Do you have living family in Leipzig?" one asked. "I don't know," she replied. "Not since '43. They gave her a stamped identity card, cream-colored with civilian printed in black across the bottom. There was no mention of service, no rank, just her name. She held it in her hands for a long while. It looked simple, even fragile, but it felt heavier than any insignia she'd ever worn. In a waiting room, a table had been laid out with tea, bread, hard cheese, and boiled eggs. It wasn't much, but enough. Greta ate slowly, eyes watching the door, wondering who she'd be when she walked through it. As she finished her tea, the interpreter, the quiet man from the nurses' rounds, approached her again. "You're on the next convoy south," he said. "Train leaves in 40 minutes. She nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are they treating us like this, after everything?" He didn't smile, didn't lecture, He just sat beside her and looked down at his tea. Because if we treat you the way you treated others, then nothing changes. And we lose too. Greta stared at the floor. That answer didn't make her feel forgiven. It made her feel responsible. Before she boarded the train, a British nurse handed her a small brown paper parcel. "What is it?" Greta asked. "Supplies for the road, soap, towel, sanitary items, and a comb." Greta took it with both hands, stunned. "You didn't have to." The nurse shook her head. "No, we didn't, but we did." The train platform was empty except for a few armed MPs and the dozen or so women waiting quietly beside Greta. The train arrived on time, a long, dented thing, smoke hissing from its stack. Not a cattle car, not a prisoner transport, just a train. Greta climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and watched as the countryside rolled past. Fields, ruins, wind. The rhythm of the train rocked gently. And for the first time, her body allowed itself to rest without vigilance. She didn't know what she'd find in Leipzig, maybe rubble, maybe no one. But she would arrive not in shame, not entirely, but in silence and in truth. No flag awaited her, no medals, no salutes, only a city that had survived. And the quiet chance to begin again. The train slowed at dusk, its brakes screeching through a landscape of skeletons. Greta pressed her palm against the window pane and stared at what used to be Leipzig. Chimneys stood like gravestones, and the horizon was a forest of twisted iron. The glass was cold under her fingertips. It didn't feel like home, only a reminder of how far from it she had drifted. When the train stopped, no one spoke. The doors opened with a metallic sigh, and a warm gust of ash and wet earth filled the carriage. The station platform had no roof anymore, just broken beams silhouetted against a bruised sky. British soldiers were nowhere to be seen now. The Red Army had taken over this zone. Greta stepped out with her satchel slung across her shoulder, one of 1,000 ghosts returning to ruins. The first thing she noticed was the smell, not death anymore, but mold, old wood, and rain on brick. The city was breathing again, shallowly, stubbornly. A few market stalls had reopened under canvas. People shuffled past, carrying sacks of potatoes, their eyes too tired to judge. She walked, not because she knew where she was going, but because stopping meant remembering. Her shoes scraped through puddles that reflected shattered windows. Street signs were gone, painted over with red stars and new names. Once familiar corners now bore slogans in Cyrillic. She found her family's old building by instinct more than sight. A 4-story house near Johannisplatz, or what was left of it. The top 2 floors had collapsed. The doorway was bricked shut except for a narrow gap where someone had pried the mortar loose. She crouched and crawled inside. The stairwell still smelled faintly of coal dust and cabbage, a scent so ordinary it made her knees buckle. The apartment door was gone. The walls inside were bare. Furniture had been scavenged long ago. On the windowsill lay a single cup, cracked, half filled with gray rainwater. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. Her mother had owned one just like it. Maybe it was hers, maybe not. It didn't matter. She set it back down gently, as if returning something sacred to its altar. Outside, voices echoed. A Russian patrol, boots squelching through mud. Greta stayed still, back against the wall, until they passed. Their laughter was tired, but harmless. For the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid. She had no uniform, no rank, no cause. There was nothing left to punish. She spent that night in the stairwell, wrapped in her coat, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere distant, a piano played a broken tune, a few surviving notes of something from before. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her. By morning, the street filled with the hum of work. Women pushed carts loaded with bricks. Men salvaged wood from collapsed roofs. A child, barefoot and grubby, sat on a curb playing with a tin soldier missing both legs. Greta approached him and asked, "Where did you get that?" He shrugged. The war left it. The simplicity of his answer cut through her like a blade. The war had left everything, and everyone, broken in pieces small enough to be toys. She spent the next week drifting. There were no rations for people like her, not yet processed, not yet anything. But kindness survived in corners. An old woman at a soup line slipped her a bowl. A baker gave her the last crust when he saw the British soap tucked in her pocket. They knew what it meant, that she had been captured, that she had been fed by the enemy. Yet no one spat, no one cursed. They only looked at her with the dull understanding of those who had run out of energy for hate. On the 5th day, she found work. A Soviet officer in charge of reconstruction needed women to clear rubble along Karl Liebknecht Strasse. The pay was a bowl of soup and a blanket. Greta accepted. For hours, she shoveled brick and ash, side by side with strangers. Each strike of the shovel felt like penance, but also renewal. They didn't speak of politics. They spoke of roofs, of lost sons, of bread that might arrive next week. In that stripped-down vocabulary of survival, she found a kind of honesty she'd never known. When evening came, she washed her hands in a public fountain. The water ran red with dust. She remembered the British wash-house, the steam, the kindness. And for a moment, it felt like two worlds touching, past and present. A woman nearby looked at her and said, "You were one of them, weren't you?" Greta froze. One of who? The helpers, the ones in uniform. Greta lowered her gaze. "I was." The woman nodded once slowly. "Then help now." It wasn't condemnation, it was instruction. That night, Greta sat on the foundation of a half-collapsed wall, the wind tugging at her coat. The city stretched before her, ruined, restless, alive. She watched a young girl draw water from a barrel, her bare feet muddy, her laughter rising like a song that refused to die. And in that sound, laughter, fragile and unashamed, Greta heard the first real proof that the world could still make something new out of what it had broken. She didn't smile. Not yet. But the corners of her eyes softened. Tomorrow, she would return to the rubble site. She would shovel again. Brick by brick, she would help the city forget her name, and in doing so, learn it anew. The morning broke pale and clean. The first sunlight Greta had seen without the filter of smoke in years. She walked toward the rubble site with a quiet steadiness, her satchel slung over one shoulder, hair tied back with a strip of torn linen. The air smelled of thawing earth and brick dust. Around her, the city stirred like something just waking after a long illness. Children carried pails of mortar water. Women knelt among piles of stone, their hands wrapped in rags to keep the skin from splitting. Men hoisted beams and hammered nails scavenged from bombed-out houses. No flags hung anywhere, no colors, no crests, just gray, red, and the faint glimmer of morning light on wet stone. Greta joined the line of women passing bricks hand to hand. The rhythm felt natural. Lift, pass, like a heartbeat that belonged to something larger than any one person. No one asked who she had been. Here, names didn't matter. The past was just another ruin to be cleared away. By noon, the sun broke through fully. Dust sparkled in the air like ash from an old fire finally cooling. Greta paused, wiped sweat from her brow, and looked up. Above the hollowed skyline, the bells of St. Nicholas Church rang faintly. The tower had been hit, but someone had strung a rope through the remaining bell. Its tone was warped, uneven, but alive. For the first time in years, she didn't hear the sound of war in it. only the sound of endurance. At the break, she sat on a toppled stone step with a few others. A Soviet guard brought around a bucket of thin soup and a loaf of bread. Greta accepted hers without a word. The guard looked young, too young, his rifle longer than his arm. When he poured her soup, he didn't look her in the eye. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he didn't know what to make of a German woman smiling at him with quiet thanks. She sipped slowly, the broth weak but warm, and thought of the British camp, of tea, of folded blankets, of a toilet that flushed, and a nurse who spoke gently through exhaustion. She had lived 2 lives since then, one behind barbed wire, one among ruins. Both had taught her something she could not yet name. When the break ended, she rose again, her body aching but her steps sure. The work continued until sunset. As the last wheelbarrow was emptied, Greta looked at the space they had cleared. A wall now stood where rubble had been, a simple foundation outlined in chalk. The foreman said it would be housing. Nothing grand, but dry and standing. It struck her that she was rebuilding the same kind of world she had once helped destroy, and that perhaps was justice enough. That evening, she walked down to the river. The Elster was swollen with spring melt, its surface reflecting the faint orange glow of evening fires from distant chimneys. She sat on the embankment, knees drawn to her chest, and watched the current carry bits of debris downstream, twigs, scraps of paper, sometimes a piece of scorched wood. Everything was being carried somewhere, even her. Across the river, children were skipping stones. Each splash echoed like punctuation in the long, unfinished sentence of the war. Greta reached into her satchel and took out her diary, the one she'd kept since her days as a signals operator. The pages smelled of damp and smoke. Most of it was filled with old codes, names and locations that no longer meant anything. She turned to a blank page. Her pencil hovered for a long time before she wrote. Be May 18th, 1945. The war is over. I am alive. The world is neither kind nor cruel. It is only waiting. Today I passed bricks to build a wall. A woman thanked me. That is all. She closed the book, tied it with a string, and tucked it back inside her satchel. Then she unwrapped the British comb the nurse had given her weeks ago. It was still ivory-colored, still perfect. She ran it through her hair, slow and careful, until the tangles loosened. It was a ritual now, not vanity, but remembrance. Behind her, the church bell rang again, a faint echo across the water. Greta looked up. The light had turned gold. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without measuring the air, without waiting for the next order. And there, on that riverbank, she finally understood what the war had taken, and what impossibly it had given back. Not innocence, that was gone forever, but choice, the right to be ordinary, the right to wash her hands in clean water and know it would not run red, the right to hear her own name, not barked, not recorded, not listed, but spoken softly, by herself as a prayer. She stood and looked toward the ruined city. Smoke curled upward in gentle plumes. Somewhere beyond those walls, people were lighting lamps, baking bread, arguing, laughing. Life was returning, quietly, stubbornly, like grass through cracked concrete. Greta turned toward it and began to walk. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but light, as if the weight she'd carried had at last been set down. The sound of her boots on stone blended with the river's murmur, a rhythm older than nations, older than fear. For the first time, she didn't feel like a survivor or a captive. She felt human, and in that fragile, luminous moment, beneath a sky washed clean by war, Greta Hoffmann, once a servant of the Reich, walked home through the ruins, carrying nothing but water, light, and her own reborn silence.